Hi there, this is Dr. Anna Maria Helt, herbalist and microbiologist, here with Basmati.com and my almost ever-present sidekick, Milo. And so our herb of the week this week is hops. And this is a pretty well-known plant, given the number of beer and ale drinkers in the world. So here are some dried hops strobiles, or they're the flowers that ultimately turn into the fruit. And here's one up close. It's a little flat just because it's been stored in a bag, but this is the medicine part of the vine. And actually a really key part of this medicine, I don't know how well you can see this yellowish powder there, very sticky, very aromatic, just like hops. That's the medicine. That's a big part of the medicine right there. And the flavor as well. And so hops, Humulus lupulus, is a European plant that is the most common species used for things like beers and ales and such. It's naturalized here, this plant. Now, there's also a North American native hops plant, Humulus americanus, that you can find in small areas, or little isolated areas, I should say, of Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and through the Rockies as well. And so we do have a native one here, a wild hops, as it were, as well. And so the word hops itself is derived from an Anglo-Saxon word that means to climb. And so hops is a vine. It's actually a beautiful vine, and it's huge. It can be upwards of 40 feet tall. Some people have claimed to see it grow a foot a day. It's a very robust vine. And you can grow your own if you've got space for it to climb. And if you do grow your own, or you are lucky to live where there are wild or naturalized hops growing, you can gather the strobiles, these little guys, when they are starting to feel kind of dry, papery, light, like these guys are, and they will be noticeably sticky. And so hops, again, most people know it as a bittering agent in beers and ales, and it's been a preservative in beers since about 800 CE. And it's interesting because now with all these great, delicious hoppy ales that we have out, IPAs and things like that, most people associate hops with ales especially, more than just beer. Hops are in both at this point. But back in the day, way back then, almost a couple thousand years ago, hops were found only in beer. Ales were made with other botanicals, and hops were used as a bittering agent and also as a preservative. And so Gerard, 16th century herbalist, actually talks about this topic of beer versus ale. And what he says is the manifold virtue of hops do manifest. Sorry, let me go back. The manifold virtues of hops that do manifest argue the wholesomeness of beer above ale. So he was a hops guy. And 17th century herbalist Nicholas Culpeper said something similar, that by all these testimonies, beer appears to be better than ale. And again, this all comes down to the historical use of hops with all of its various medicinal properties in beer rather than ale. But nowadays, hops is in both. And boy, is it in some things really strongly. Now, hops is actually in the same family as cannabis, and this is not a very big family, but these are two genera, Humulus and cannabis, that are in this family. And no need to worry, you're not going to get stoned if you use hops as medicine. It is a strong sedative, but their chemistry between hops and cannabis differs. There is some overlap there, but for instance, hops it lacks the enzyme to ultimately produce cannabinoids like THC, and THC is the psychoactive component of cannabis. Hops also can't make CBD, which is getting to be a more and more famous cannabinoid from cannabis for things like seizures and pain and such. So hops actually doesn't have things like THC or CBD in it, but it does have some other chemical overlap with cannabis. A little bit, not in terms of getting high. So if you think you're going to get some hops and get high like you can with marijuana, no, different plant. Now, hops does have some interesting chemistry though, and it can be a very strong sedative. And one of the chemicals it has, once they're dried, and smell really bitter is valeric acid, which is a really pungent smelling chemical that's also found in valerian root. And this is a chemical that acts on GABA receptors. And so this is one of the reasons why both hops and valerian are popular botanicals to use for poor sleep, because they are strongly sedative through the effects that they have in the brain on our neurotransmitters and receptors and such. Hops is especially good for insomnia and kind of overly wound type A people. It's also great for anxiety and fear as a sedative. If you want it during the day and you don't want to be drowsy, you can use it as a liquid extract or a tincture. You could sip it as a tea, but it's really bitter. But you could just do low doses during the day to kind of bring yourself down. But if you're, about to have a panic attack or fear is really high, then you can do a bigger dose of hops. And so I don't like to fly. I do fly to get where I need to go, but I don't like it. And so on my more nervous trips, I will use hops in bigger doses, a squirt or two. And that kind of just renders me a little too tired to really care that I'm in a plane. Hops is also useful outside of the nervous system. It's a great digestive bitter. Actually, I shouldn't say that's outside of the nervous system. Digestive bitters are, as I've talked about before, those plants that taste bitter, and they activate bitter receptors in our tongue that sends a signal through the nervous system to the digestive tract to have it make more digestive fluids and enzymes and such. And so hops is a digestive bitter tonic for improving digestion. It's aromatic in it, or volatile oil is great for gas and bloating and things like that. And spasms, belching. People do burp after drinking beer and ales, but that's because of the carbonation. It's not because of the hops. Hops, moving out of the digestive tract, is also useful for various types of pain. And so nerve pain, for instance, of various forms, muscle tension or muscle pain. You could do it internally as a formula, or maybe you could include it in a topical salve. The aromatics will penetrate, although you'll smell like ale, but maybe you could try mixing it with some things like lavender and rose and bury the scent just a little bit. Hops is also great. I mentioned using it for insomnia and such, where you could use it as a tea or part of a tea blend, use it as a liquid extract or what have you, maybe a few doses in the evening before you go to bed. But another great way to use hops for sleep that I almost forgot to mention is as a sleep pillow. And so you can stuff a cloth or a clean old sock or whatever with some dried hops and maybe put some other great relaxing aromatics in it, like the aforementioned lavender and rose and such. And, seal that up and stick it in your pillowcase. And it's a great way to have a good night's sleep. One other use before I sign off for hops is hot flashes, and this is due to its phytoestrogenic activity. Now, phytoestrogens, to be clear, are not estrogen, and phytoestrogens have a very complicated interaction with our endocrine or our hormonal system. They don't turn into estrogen in the body. There is some misunderstanding about that. But it's through its chemistry that hops can actually help with hot flashes. Now, along those lines, you will often see warnings to avoid hops when there is a history of estrogen receptor positive cancers, meaning that cancer growth is stimulated by estrogen. But the actual studies on hops are conflicting on this. So, for instance, in some experimental models, hops, like in a petri dish or in cell cultures, that kind of stuff, hops does exhibit some estrogenic activity, but only at very high concentrations of the hops, much higher than you would get, for instance, using it as a sleep herb. In other studies, hops actually inhibited the proliferation of estrogen receptor positive cancer cells in a dish. So it's not really clear what the final answer is. So it's probably a good idea to be careful at this point, and with the lack of adequate research, to avoid hops if you do have a history of estrogen receptor dependent cancers, just to be safe. And then hops also is contraindicated with depression based on traditional usage that goes back centuries. And you might, at least in terms of hops, as medicine, as a tincture, tea, and such, maybe not a great idea to combine it with prescription sedatives, because you might get additive effects and really knock yourself out in not a great way. So that's hops. Maybe remember some of the great qualities it has the next time you are having an ale. And if you don't drink beer or ale, that's fine because you can get hops in many other forms. Like I said, a sleep pillow, liquid extracts, tea, and such. And until next time, be well.